I watched the last shovelful of North Carolina red clay settle over Bobby's mahogany casket when Vinnie Torres dropped to one knee beside me, right there at the graveside, with half our small town watching. His weathered hand gripped mine too tightly as he pulled out a small velvet box that caught the afternoon sunlight. "Maggie," he said, his voice carrying across the cemetery like he wanted everyone at Oakwood Memorial to hear. "Bobby would want you taken care of. You don't have to be alone anymore. Marry me." The world tilted sideways. I felt the collective gasp from our friends and neighbors, heard my daughter Sarah's sharp intake of breath, saw my son Michael's jaw drop in my peripheral vision. But all I could feel was the hot shame burning up my neck, the disbelief choking the air from my lungs, and the terrible realization that the man I'd trusted to help me through the worst day of my life had just turned it into something infinitely worse. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I just stared at Vinnie's face, trying to find some trace of the childhood friend who used to build sandcastles with Bobby on Wrightsville Beach, the best man at our wedding 32 years ago, the business partner who'd helped Bobby build Torres & Caldwell Educational Consulting from nothing into the most respected firm in eastern North Carolina. Instead, I saw a stranger with calculating eyes and a practiced smile, kneeling in the dirt beside my husband's grave, like he was claiming territory. I pulled my hand away and stood without a word, my black heels sinking slightly into the soft earth. I walked past the stunned faces of our church family, past the wilted flowers and sympathy cards, past everything that had once felt safe and familiar. I drove home to our yellow Cape Cod on Pelican Lane in silence, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, Bobby's favorite Brahms symphony playing softly from the radio like a ghost's lullaby. What I discovered later that evening, hidden in Bobby's old briefcase beneath years of school board meeting notes and budget reports, would change everything I thought I knew about trust family and the man I'd been mourning. But first, let me tell you about the life Vinnie Torres tried to steal from me, piece by careful piece, until I almost forgot it had ever been mine at all. Bobby and I met during my second year at East Carolina University when I was 20, and still believed the world was fundamentally good. He was studying education administration, while I pursued my library science degree, both of us small-town kids with big dreams and modest bank accounts. Our first date was at the campus coffee shop where I worked 20 hours a week to pay for textbooks, my hands stained with espresso, and my apron dusted with cinnamon. Bobby ordered a simple black coffee and left a $2 tip on a 50-cent purchase, not to impress me, but because he'd worked food service himself and understood what those quarters meant. That small kindness told me everything I needed to know about his character. We married the summer after graduation, a simple ceremony at First Baptist in my hometown of Beaufort, with reception cake made by my grandmother and flowers picked from my mother's garden. Bobby wore his father's suit altered to fit his broader shoulders, and I wore my mother's wedding dress taken in at the waist and hemmed to accommodate my shorter frame. Vinnie Torres stood beside Bobby as best man cracking jokes during the rehearsal dinner that made everyone laugh until their sides ached, toasting our future with cheap champagne and genuine affection. Back then, Vinnie was like the brother. Bobby never had the loyal friend who showed up when you needed help moving furniture or a drinking buddy after a hard day. I loved him like family, because Bobby did never imagining that love could curdle into something predatory, given enough time and opportunity. Those early years were lean, but happy. Bobby taught high school history, while earning his master's degree in educational administration, coming home each evening with stories about teenage drama and small victories that made him smile even when he was exhausted. I worked at the county library starting as a part-time circulation clerk and slowly working my way up to head librarian, creating reading programs for children and literacy classes for adults who'd never learned. We lived in a tiny rental house with thin walls and a leaky roof, but we painted every room ourselves and planted a vegetable garden that produced more tomatoes than two people could reasonably eat. Vinny visited regularly, often staying for dinner when his latest relationship ended, or when he needed Bobby's advice about starting his consulting business. I remember the night Bobby and Vinny decided to become partners, sitting at our kitchen table with legal pads covered in scribbled business plans and revenue projections. Bobby had just been offered the principal position at Carteret County High School, his dream job, but Vinny convinced him they could build something bigger together. "We know schools from the inside out," Vinny argued, his dark eyes bright with ambition. "We can help districts implement real change, not just talk about it in committee meetings." Bobby was hesitant at first, comfortable with the security of a steady paycheck and state benefits, but I encouraged him to take the risk. "You have so many ideas about how to improve education," I told him that night as we lay in bed listening to the cicadas sing outside our window. "Maybe this is your chance to help more kids than just the ones in your building." Zephyr. So, Torres and Caldwell Educational Consulting was born with Bobby handling curriculum development and implementation, while Vinny managed client relations and business development. They complemented each other perfectly in those early days, Bobby's thoughtful analysis balancing Vinny's aggressive sales tactics, creating a reputation for practical solutions delivered with genuine care for students and teachers. As the business grew, we were able to buy our house on Pelican Lane, a 1950s Cape Cod, with original hardwood floors, built-in bookshelves, and a wraparound porch where Bobby and I spent countless evenings reading and talking, while the sunset painted the sky pink and orange over the Sound. Sarah arrived when I was 28, a serious baby who rarely cried, but watched everything with enormous brown eyes inherited from her father. Michael followed 3 years later, a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, who kept us running from the moment he learned to walk. Bobby was a devoted father, the kind who never missed a school play or soccer game, who helped with homework every night, and read bedtime stories with different voices for each character. Vinny became Uncle Vinny to our children, bringing elaborate birthday gifts and taking them fishing when Bobby was traveling for work. He seemed genuinely fond of Sarah and Michael, teaching them card games and listening patiently to their endless questions about everything from dinosaurs to space travel. As the years passed, our business thrived and our family grew closer. Bobby eventually bought out Vinny's shares when Vinny decided to semi-retire and move to Florida, though they remained close friends and occasional collaborators. We thought we'd found the perfect balance between work and family success and simplicity. Bobby was respected throughout the state educational system, frequently invited to speak at conferences, and consulted on policy changes. I had built the county library into a true community resource, expanding our programming and securing grants that allowed us to serve families who might otherwise lack access to books and technology. Our children grew into confident, kind adults who called regularly and visited often, Sarah becoming a social worker in Charlotte and Michael teaching elementary school right here in Beaufort. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning in March, while Bobby was reviewing budget proposals for a rural district outside Asheville. I was reshelving returned books when the hospital called, the nurse's voice gentle but urgent, as she explained that Bobby had collapsed during a client meeting and been rushed to Cape Fear Valley Medical Center. By the time I reached the hospital, driving 90 miles per hour through spring rain, with Vinny following close behind, Bobby was gone. "Massive coronary," the doctor explained, using clinical terms that couldn't capture the sudden, complete destruction of the life we'd built together. No warning signs, no opportunity for goodbyes, just the terrible silence where his laughter used to be. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of funeral arrangements, casseroles from church friends, and the suffocating weight of decisions I'd never imagined making alone. Vinny appeared almost immediately, driving up from his condo in Wilmington the same day Bobby died, taking charge of details I was too numb to handle. He contacted Bobby's clients to explain the situation, managed the flood of sympathy calls, and helped Sarah and Michael coordinate their time off work. At the time, I felt grateful for his presence, believing he was honoring his friendship with Bobby, by caring for the family left behind. I had no idea he was positioning himself to take much more than I was willing to give. Looking back now, I can see the subtle ways Vinny began inserting himself into my grief, presenting himself as indispensable, while quietly undermining my confidence in my ability to manage alone. He'd arrive each morning with coffee and the newspaper settling into Bobby's chair at the kitchen table, like he belonged there, discussing my day's schedule, as if I were a child who needed supervision. When I mentioned wanting to sort through Bobby's office at the consulting firm, Vinny insisted it would be too emotional, too overwhelming offering to handle everything himself. "You shouldn't have to deal with business files and tax documents right now," he said, with what seemed like genuine concern. "Let me take care of the practical stuff so you can focus on healing." The funeral was held on a gray Thursday at First Baptist, the same church where Bobby and I had been married, where we'd watched our children be baptized, where we'd celebrated and mourned alongside our community for over 3 decades. The sanctuary was packed with colleagues from across the state, former students who'd driven hours to pay their respects, and neighbors who remembered Bobby's kindness during their own difficult times. I sat in the front pew between Sarah and Michael, wearing the black dress I'd bought for Bobby's mother's funeral 5 years earlier, my hands clutching a tissue that had long since disintegrated from overuse. The service was beautiful, filled with hymns Bobby had loved and stories that captured his gentle spirit and dedication to education. After the final prayer, we processed slowly to Oakwood Memorial Cemetery, where 4 generations of Bobby's family were buried beneath ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The graveside service was brief, just close family and friends gathering around the mahogany casket we'd chosen because it reminded me of the bookshelves Bobby had built in our living room. I stood beside the open grave, supported by my children's presence, and surrounded by people who had genuinely loved my husband, never imagining that my deepest humiliation was only moments away. That's when Vinny Torres destroyed whatever remained of my dignity, dropping to one knee beside Bobby's grave, like he was proposing in some romantic movie, instead of exploiting my widowhood in front of half the town. The stunned silence that followed his proposal felt endless, heavy with shock and secondhand embarrassment. I could see our pastor's horrified expression, hear my sister-in-law's sharp gasp, feel the collective discomfort of friends who didn't know where to look or what to say. Even the funeral director, a man who'd seen every possible family drama play out over 20 years in the business, stood frozen with his clipboard, clearly unprepared for this particular breach of decorum. I don't remember driving home from the cemetery, though I must have since my car was in the driveway, when I finally became aware of my surroundings again. I found myself sitting in Bobby's chair in our living room, still wearing my funeral dress, staring at the bookshelves he'd built with such careful attention to detail. Every board had been measured twice, every joint fitted perfectly, every shelf aligned with the precision of a man who believed good work was its own reward. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was contemplating the craftsmanship of a dead man while trying to process a marriage proposal from his best friend. Sarah and Michael arrived within an hour, their faces tight with concern and barely contained anger. "Mom, that was completely inappropriate," Sarah said, settling onto the couch across from me with the careful movements of someone trying to control their emotions. "I can't believe he did that today at Dad's funeral." Michael paced behind her, his hands clenched into fists, looking more like his father than ever in his navy suit and burgundy tie. "I wanted to punch him," he admitted, his voice rough with unshed tears. "Right there in front of everyone. How could he think that was okay?" I tried to respond to reassure them that I was fine, that Vinny's proposal had been misguided, but not malicious, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself defending him in ways that surprised even me. "He's grieving too," I heard myself saying. Bobby was his best friend for 40 years. People do strange things when they're in shock. Even as I spoke, I knew my words sounded hollow, unconvincing, even to myself. But some part of me still wanted to believe that Vinny's proposal had been born from genuine care, rather than calculated opportunism. That night, after Sarah and Michael had reluctantly returned to their hotels, I sat alone in the house that felt simultaneously too big and too small without Bobby's presence. Every room held memories of our life together, from the kitchen, where we'd shared thousands of meals, to the bedroom, where we'd whispered our dreams and fears in the darkness. I found myself wandering from space to space, touching objects that had been part of our shared story, trying to make sense of a future that felt utterly foreign and terrifying. It was then that I decided to sort through Bobby's briefcase, something I'd been avoiding since the day he died. The brown leather case sat in his home office, still containing the papers he'd been reviewing the morning of his heart attack. I'd been meaning to return it to the consulting firm's office, but Vinny had repeatedly offered to handle it, insisting I shouldn't burden myself with work-related materials during my time of grief. Now, sitting in the quiet house with nothing but my thoughts for company, I felt ready to face this final connection to Bobby's professional life. The briefcase opened with the familiar snap I'd heard thousands of times over the years, releasing the scent of leather and paper that always reminded me of Bobby's dedication to his work. Inside, I found the expected items: budget reports, implementation timelines, client correspondence, and meeting notes written in Bobby's careful handwriting. But beneath these professional documents, tucked into a side pocket I'd never noticed before, was a manila envelope marked "Personal" in Bobby's distinctive print. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope, not knowing what to expect, but sensing that whatever I found would be significant. Inside was a letter addressed to me in Bobby's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death, along with a sealed envelope marked "For my attorney only," and a small key I didn't recognize. The letter was written on Bobby's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper we'd used for thank you notes and condolence cards over the years. My dearest Maggie. The letter began, and I could hear Bobby's voice in every word, gentle but serious in the way he became when discussing something important. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hate that I didn't have the courage to discuss these concerns with you while I was alive. I've been worried about Vinny's behavior toward our family, and toward our business for several months now. I hope I'm wrong, but I've seen changes in him that trouble me deeply. I stopped reading, my heart pounding with a mixture of grief and confusion. Bobby had been worried about Vinny. In all our conversations about the business, about their friendship, about retirement plans and family gatherings, he'd never mentioned any concerns about his oldest friend. I forced myself to continue reading, desperate to understand what Bobby had seen that I'd apparently missed. Vinny has been asking too many questions about our finances, about the business succession plan, about you. The letter continued. He suggested more than once that you wouldn't be able to manage on your own if something happened to me, that you'd need someone to take care of practical matters. When I disagreed, he became defensive, insisting that he was only thinking about your welfare. But there's something in his eyes when he talks about you now, something possessive that makes me uncomfortable. The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence reframing conversations and interactions I'd dismissed as harmless concern. I remembered Vinny's comments about my sheltered life, his suggestions that I was too naive to understand financial matters, his insistence that Bobby protected me from the harsh realities of business ownership. At the time, these remarks had seemed like gentle teasing between old friends, but now they took on a darker significance. Bobby's letter went on to detail specific incidents I'd either forgotten or never knew about Vinny, asking about our life insurance policies, requesting copies of our wills, suggesting that Bobby should consider giving him power of attorney, just in case. Most disturbing was Bobby's account of a conversation they'd had just days before his death, when Vinny had mentioned how lonely I'd be as a widow, how much I'd need a man's guidance and protection. "I've taken steps to protect you and our family," Bobby's letter concluded. "I've updated our wills and financial arrangements without Vinny's knowledge, and I've included specific instructions for my attorney about handling the business and our personal assets. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank that contains additional documents you'll need. I pray I'm being overly cautious, but I'd rather be paranoid than leave you vulnerable. I love you more than words can express, and I trust you to be stronger than anyone gives you credit for, including yourself sometimes." I sat in Bobby's office chair, clutching the letter and crying harder than I had since the day he died. These weren't tears of pure grief, but a complex mixture of sorrow, relief, and a strange kind of gratitude. Bobby had seen what I couldn't, had protected me, even when I didn't know I needed protection, had trusted me with the truth, even though he couldn't share his concerns while he was alive. The man I'd been mourning had left me one final gift, the knowledge that I wasn't as alone or as helpless as I'd been led to believe. The next morning, I drove to First National Bank with Bobby's letter and the mysterious key, my hands steady for the first time since the funeral. The safety deposit box contained copies of our updated wills, life insurance policies, business documents, and a detailed letter to Bobby's attorney explaining his concerns about Vinny's behavior. Most importantly, it contained proof that Bobby had quietly transferred ownership of our house, our investments, and his shares in the consulting business into a trust that protected everything from outside interference. Vinny Torres had no legal claim to anything Bobby and I had built together, despite whatever plans he might have been making. But Bobby's protections went beyond legal documents. Hidden in the safety deposit box was a small recording device and a transcript of a conversation between Bobby and Vinny that had taken place just weeks before Bobby's death. In the recording, Vinny could be heard discussing his plans for taking care of Maggie after Bobby was gone, describing me as helpless and dependent, someone who would be grateful for a man's guidance. Most chilling was Vinny's casual comment about how much easier it would be to manage the business without Bobby's sentimental attachment to unprofitable clients and charitable projects. Listening to that recording, I felt the last of my illusions about Vinny Torres crumble away. This wasn't a grieving friend making a misguided romantic gesture. This was a calculated predator who had been circling my marriage for months, waiting for an opportunity to swoop in and claim everything Bobby and I had worked to build. The proposal at Bobby's graveside hadn't been impulsive or emotional. It had been the opening move in a strategy Vinny had been planning long before my husband was cold in the ground. Armed with Bobby's evidence and burning with quiet fury, I made my way to the law office of Patricia Hendricks, the attorney Bobby had trusted with our most important legal matters. Mrs. Hendricks was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and steel-gray eyes, who had built her practice on protecting families from exactly the kind of predatory behavior Vinny had exhibited. She reviewed Bobby's documents with the thoroughness of someone who had seen similar cases before nodding grimly as she absorbed the full scope of his precautions. "Your husband was very wise to document his concerns," Mrs. Hendricks told me, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting for vulnerable clients. "Mr. Torres has no legal standing to claim any portion of your estate, your business interests, or your personal property. The trust structure Bobby created is ironclad, and the recording provides clear evidence of predatory intent should Mr. Torres choose to contest anything through the courts." For the first time since Bobby's death, I felt something besides grief and confusion. I felt powerful, protected, and deeply grateful to the man who had loved me enough to anticipate dangers I couldn't see coming. Bobby had given me the tools I needed to protect myself and our children from a threat I'd been too trusting to recognize. Now, all I had to do was decide how to use them. I chose to start quietly, the way Bobby would have handled the situation. Instead of confronting Vinny directly, I began documenting his behavior, recording our conversations, and gathering evidence of his attempts to manipulate me and control access to Bobby's business assets. When Vinny called to suggest I shouldn't make any major decisions about the consulting firm until I'd had time to think clearly, I let him talk while recording every word. When he offered to help me understand Bobby's financial arrangements, I encouraged him to explain his interpretation while documenting his misstatements and outright lies. Most revealing was Vinny's reaction when I mentioned having lunch with Mrs. Hendricks to discuss Bobby's estate planning. His voice immediately became sharp, demanding to know what we'd discussed, insisting that he should be included in any legal consultations since he'd been Bobby's business partner and closest friend. "You don't understand how complicated these business arrangements can be," he said, his mask of concern slipping to reveal something uglier underneath. "You need someone who understands Bobby's vision for the company's future." But I was no longer the grieving widow who could be manipulated with false sympathy and manufactured crises. I was Bobby Caldwell's wife, protected by his love and armed with his carefully documented warnings. When Vinny suggested that I should sign over power of attorney to him temporarily, while I adjusted to widowhood, I smiled sweetly and told him I'd consider it. When he offered to manage Bobby's client relationships and business accounts, I thanked him for his concern and promised to let him know when I was ready to make such important decisions. What Vinny didn't know was that I'd already made the most important decision of all I was done being underestimated, overlooked, and manipulated by someone who mistook kindness for weakness and grief for helplessness. The confrontation came exactly 6 weeks after Bobby's funeral on a warm April evening, when the azaleas were blooming pink and white along Pelican Lane. Vinny had invited himself over for dinner, as he'd been doing increasingly often, arriving with a bottle of wine and an agenda I was finally prepared to address. He settled into Bobby's chair at the kitchen table, as if he belonged there, launching into what had become his usual routine of gentle criticism, disguised as helpful advice. "Maggie, you really need to think about selling this house," he said, gesturing around the kitchen. Bobby and I had renovated together just 3 years earlier. "It's too big for one person, too expensive to maintain, too full of memories that are keeping you stuck in the past. I know a good realtor who could help you find something more appropriate, maybe a nice condo, where you wouldn't have to worry about yard work and repairs." I continued preparing dinner, letting him talk, while the recording device in my pocket captured every word. This was the same kitchen where Bobby had taught our children to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, where we'd hosted countless holiday dinners, where I'd learned to cook my grandmother's recipes and created new traditions for our family. Vinny's casual dismissal of our home's significance revealed everything I needed to know about his understanding of what mattered to me. "And this consulting business?" Vinny continued, warming to his theme. "You can't possibly manage Bobby's client relationships on your own. These are million-dollar contracts with school districts across 3 states. You've never been involved in the operational side of things. The responsible thing would be to let me buy out Bobby's share of the company, maybe keep you on as a silent partner, so you'd still have some income." I turned to face him, then wooden spoon still in my hand, and asked the question I'd been saving for exactly this moment. "Vinny, do you remember the conversation you had with Bobby about taking care of me after he was gone?" His face went very still, his wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. "What conversation?" he asked carefully, but I could see the calculation in his eyes, the rapid mental review of everything he'd said and who might have overheard. "The one where you called me helpless and dependent." I continued, calmly pulling the recording device from my pocket and setting it on the table between us. "The one where you discussed how much easier it would be to run the business without Bobby's sentimental attachment to unprofitable clients. The one where you planned how you'd manage me after my husband died." The color drained from Vinny's face, but he rallied quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. Maggie, I think grief is making you paranoid. I never said anything like that. I've only been trying to help you through a difficult time. Lum. I pressed play on the recording device, and Bobby's voice filled the kitchen, clear and unmistakable, as he documented his conversation with Vinny just days before his death. We listened together as Vinny's voice described me as a sweet woman who would be grateful for guidance and too overwhelmed to ask difficult questions about business decisions. We heard him dismiss Bobby's concerns about maintaining the company's scholarship fund for underprivileged students, calling it a bleeding heart waste of money that could be eliminated once Bobby was out of the picture. When the recording ended, Vinny sat in silence for a long moment, his hands gripping his wineglass like an anchor. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth or concern. You don't understand what you're dealing with, Maggie. This business is worth millions, and you have no idea how to run it. Those clients aren't going to take orders from a librarian who's never managed anything more complicated than a book club. I smiled at him, then the same sweet smile I'd perfected during 30 years of dealing with difficult library patrons and overzealous PTA mothers. You're right about one thing, Vinny. I am just a librarian. But librarians are very good at research, at organizing information, and at helping people find exactly what they're looking for. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out the folder Mrs. Hendricks had prepared, spreading Bobby's will, the trust documents, and the business partnership agreements across the table like a royal flush in a high-stakes poker game. What I've been looking for, I continued, is the truth about my husband's business partner and oldest friend. And what I found is that Bobby protected everything we built from people who might try to take advantage of his widow. Vinny's eyes darted across the documents, his face growing paler as he absorbed the implications of what he was seeing. Bobby left you the house free and clear? I explained, enjoying the shocked silence. He transferred his business shares into a trust that protects them from outside interference. He changed our life insurance beneficiaries to exclude anyone except immediate family. And he documented his concerns about your behavior in a sealed letter that's been filed with our attorney. Standing up slowly, I moved to stand beside Vinny's chair, close enough to see the perspiration beading on his forehead, despite the cool evening air. So, here's what's going to happen, I said in the same calm voice I'd used to explain library policies to unruly teenagers. You're going to leave my house and never come back uninvited. You're going to stop suggesting that I need a man to manage my affairs. And you're going to respect the fact that Bobby trusted me to carry on his work exactly as he would have wanted. Vinny pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor Bobby had refinished himself. You can't run that business without me, he said, his voice rising with desperation and anger. Those clients know me, trust me. You're making a mistake that's going to cost you everything Bobby worked for. I walked to the front door and opened it wide, letting the warm spring air flow through the house. The only mistake I made was trusting you, I replied. But that's a mistake I'll never make again. Vinny gathered his jacket and headed toward the door, pausing on the threshold to deliver what he clearly intended as a parting shot. You'll be back, Maggie. When the clients start canceling contracts and the money runs out, you'll realize you need me. I closed the door behind him and engaged the deadbolt Bobby had installed when we first moved to Pelican Lane. Through the front window, I watched Vinny's BMW disappear down the street, carrying with it the last remnant of my old life as someone who needed protection and guidance from men who claimed to know better. The weeks that followed brought a series of small victories that gradually restored my confidence and sense of purpose. I met with every one of Bobby's clients, personally explaining the transition plan he'd prepared and demonstrating my understanding of their needs and goals. Far from the resistance Vinny had predicted, I found genuine enthusiasm for continuing Bobby's work, especially his commitment to serving rural districts and implementing innovative programs for struggling students. Mrs. Rodriguez, the superintendent of a small mountain district, actually seemed relieved to learn that the company would maintain Bobby's personal approach to client relationships. "Your husband never made us feel like just another contract," she told me during our meeting in her modest office overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. "He understood that we're not just moving numbers around on spreadsheets, we're trying to give kids better futures." I hired Sarah to help manage the administrative side of the business, her social work background, providing valuable insight into the family dynamics that affected student achievement. Michael designed a new literacy program based on methods he'd developed in his own classroom, creating materials that other teachers could adapt for their specific student populations. For the first time since Bobby's death, I felt like I was building something meaningful rather than just protecting what already existed. The house on Pelican Lane slowly transformed from a shrine to Bobby's memory into a living space that honored our past while embracing my future. I kept his books and his chair, the photographs from our travels, and the garden he'd tended with such care. But I also added new elements that reflected my own interests and dreams, a reading nook by the front window art from local galleries, and plans for expanding the vegetable garden to include herbs I wanted to learn to grow. Sarah and Michael visited more often now, bringing their own children to play in the yard, where they'd grown up creating new memories while respecting the foundation their father had built. We talked openly about grief and healing, about the ways families can support each other without trying to control or diminish individual strength. One evening in late summer, as I sat on the front porch reading and listening to the cicadas sing in the live oaks, a car pulled into my driveway. For a moment, my heart raced with the fear that Vinny had returned, but I relaxed when I recognized the driver as Tom Henderson, Bobby's former colleague from the state education department. Tom approached the porch with obvious nervousness, his hands fidgeting with a manila envelope. "Mrs. Caldwell, I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I have something I think you should see." Inside the envelope were copies of emails between Vinny Torres and several of Bobby's clients' messages sent just days after the funeral, in which Vinny had attempted to convince them that the consulting firm would be unable to continue operating under my leadership. He'd painted himself as the only viable option for maintaining their contracts, describing me as well-meaning but inexperienced, and suggesting that Bobby's death had left the company without competent leadership. None of the clients responded favorably. Tom explained settling into the wicker chair Bobby used to occupy during our evening conversations. In fact, most of them were offended by his approach. Dr. Martinez from the Coastal District actually forwarded his emails to me because she was concerned about Mr. Torres's ethics. I thanked Tom for bringing me the information, though I wasn't surprised by Vinny's attempts at sabotage. What struck me most was how completely he'd misunderstood the relationships Bobby had built with their clients. These weren't business partnerships based on convenience or profit margins. They were professional relationships built on trust, respect, and shared commitment to educational excellence. Vinny's corporate approach had revealed him as someone who fundamentally misunderstood what made Bobby's work successful. As autumn arrived and the leaves began to turn gold and crimson along the Sound, I found myself settling into a rhythm of life that felt both familiar and new. The consulting business was thriving under my leadership, with 3 new contracts signed and plans for expanding our services to include teacher training and parent engagement programs. I'd hired 2 additional staff members, both former educators, who shared Bobby's vision of making quality education accessible to all students regardless of their economic circumstances. The house felt alive again, filled with the sounds of grandchildren playing and the laughter of friends who stopped by for coffee and conversation. I'd started hosting monthly book club meetings in the living room, continuing a tradition I'd maintained at the library, but expanding it to include community members who rarely had opportunities for intellectual discussion. Most importantly, I'd rediscovered my own voice, the one that had been gradually silenced by years of deferring to Bobby's decisions and accepting other people's assessments of my capabilities. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed tackling complex problems, how satisfying it felt to develop solutions that made real differences in people's lives. The woman who had built literacy programs from scratch and managed library systems across 3 counties had never really disappeared. She'd just been overshadowed by the role of devoted wife and mother. One crisp October morning, as I worked in Bobby's garden, harvesting the last tomatoes of the season, I found myself thinking about the letter he'd left me, the one that had changed everything about how I understood my own strength and resilience. He'd written that he trusted me to be stronger than anyone gave me credit for, including myself sometimes. At the time, reading those words through tears of grief and shock, I hadn't fully grasped their significance. Now surrounded by the vegetables Bobby had planted and tended, continuing the work he'd loved while creating new opportunities he would have embraced, I understood what he'd been trying to tell me. Strength isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's the quiet persistence of someone who refuses to be diminished, who continues growing even when others try to contain them. I gathered the ripe tomatoes in Bobby's old basket, feeling their warmth against my palms, and thinking about the meals I'd prepare with them, the friends I'd invite to share them, the simple pleasure of nurturing something from seed to harvest. This was the life Bobby had protected for me, not through control or limitation, but through trust in my ability to flourish once I remembered who I'd always been beneath the roles others had assigned me. Standing in the garden where my husband had worked with such patience and care, I offered a silent thank you to the man who had loved me enough to see dangers I couldn't recognize, wise enough to prepare protections I hadn't known I'd need, and trusting enough to believe I could rebuild our shared dreams into something uniquely mine. The sound of a car door closing interrupted my thoughts, and I looked up to see Sarah walking across the yard with a smile that reminded me of Bobby's gentle humor. "Mom, I brought lunch and a proposal for the new parent engagement program," she called, holding up a picnic basket and a folder of papers. "Are you ready to revolutionize family involvement in rural education?" I laughed, remembering Bobby's excitement whenever he'd developed a new approach to solving educational challenges. "Always," I replied, gathering my harvest and heading toward the house where my daughter waited with fresh ideas and infinite possibilities. This was what victory looked like, not the dramatic defeat of an enemy, but the quiet triumph of a woman who had learned to trust herself again, surrounded by the love and work that gave her life meaning. Behind me, the garden rested in the autumn sunshine, ready for next year's planting, just as I was ready for whatever challenges and joys the future might bring.